The fluorescent lights hummed their endless electric prayer above the St. Michael's Hospital ER in Colorado Springs, that particular hum that only existed after midnight, when the world outside went quiet and the building itself seemed to breathe. Hannah Clarke had been breathing in sync with it for 6 years now, and nobody had asked her real name in any of those years, which was precisely the point. She moved through the trauma bay like water finding its level, not fast, not slow, just exactly the speed required. Her scrubs were generic blue, her badge clipped to a lanyard she'd bought at a CVS, her dark hair pulled back in the kind of bun that made her forgettable. The night shift suited her. Fewer administrators. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions about credentials she didn't technically have under the name Hannah Clarke. Room 314 was where the contractor was sleeping off a motorcycle accident and a fractured radius. The one they'd been watching for 8 months. The one naval intelligence suspected of moving classified signals intelligence out of Kandahar on encrypted drives. Hannah had requested the night rotation specifically to monitor him, to listen to his visitors, to note the timing of his calls, to be present in case he said anything useful during the delirium that sometimes came with pain medication. She couldn't defend herself without revealing the operation. She couldn't mention the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one that identified her as Valkyrie 6, Naval Special Warfare Support Activity, because that patch would also identify 12 other people currently embedded in Colorado Springs, monitoring targets that required patience and invisibility. The ER was moderately full for a Thursday night. A woman with a migraine that wouldn't break. 2 drunk college kids with a misunderstanding about gravity and a third-floor balcony. An elderly man with chest pain that was almost certainly indigestion but had to be ruled out anyway. The machines beeped their separate rhythms, and Hannah moved between them with the kind of systematic precision that came from having spent 37 hours on her feet during the FOB Chapman siege in 2011, managing casualties with nothing but field dressing supplies and the kind of calm that only existed in people who had already watched the worst thing they would ever see. She was prepping an foresight on a new admit, a woman with acute gastroenteritis, when something ancient in her hands took over without permission. She laid out the equipment in combat triage order first. 14-gauge angiocath. Tourniquet. Alcohol wipe. Normal saline. Flush. The arrangement was wrong for a civilian hospital. It was right for a field hospital where you worked from most critical to least critical in case you only got 15 seconds before the next explosion. She caught herself 3 seconds in, rearranged the instruments in proper civilian protocol order, and smiled apologetically at her own efficiency. Habit, she said quietly, to nobody in particular. Long shift. The patient didn't notice. The hospital monitors didn't care. But Hannah felt the seam of her jacket like a brand against her ribs, that tiny patch inside the lining, still visible unit designation, still red from shrapnel heat, the only physical proof that Captain Hannah Clarke existed anywhere except in classified files 17 levels below the Pentagon. She pressed the foresight. The needle went in clean. The tourniquet released. The saline ran clear. The patient's vein accepted the catheter without rolling or blowing, which meant either Hannah had maintained her touch or the universe was being kind. She taped the site with the kind of precision that came from having placed lines in people who were actively hemorrhaging while sitting in a Humvee that was actively on fire. Your technique, a voice said behind her. Sharp. Descending. The particular cadence of someone who'd spent 15 years building a hierarchy and wasn't about to let a night shift nurse dismantle it by accident. Dr. Marcus Pierce stood in the doorway of the patient room. 53 years old. Johns Hopkins residency. 5 years as an ER attending at Walter Reed before he'd moved to Colorado Springs for a position that paid better and demanded less of him. He was wearing the expression of a man who had just noticed something he couldn't categorize, and therefore couldn't control, and therefore hated. That arrangement, he continued. The way you prepped that site. Did you actually attend an accredited nursing school, or are you just rearranging things you learned from online videos? Hannah finished securing the line. Check the flow. Made a notation in the chart. Then she looked up at him with the kind of blank professional courtesy that existed in every hospital in America, in every interaction between credentialed physicians and non-credentialed staff. 8 years at Children's National, she said quietly. Before I moved to Colorado Springs. It wasn't true. She'd spent 8 years with the Navy. But Children's National had employed her for 45 days, on the books, as operational cover, and nobody ever seemed to check dates carefully. Dr. Pierce's eyes narrowed anyway, like he could smell something on her that didn't match the official story, but couldn't quite identify what. Well, your technique is unconventional, he said, and left. Hannah sat down in the staff break room at 3:06 a.m. with a cup of coffee she didn't drink and a sandwich she didn't eat. The break room was empty, which was how she preferred it. The fluorescent lights here buzzed slightly out of sync with the ones in the ER, creating a beat frequency that made her temples ache if she listened to it long enough. She'd learned in Kandahar not to listen to things that made her temples ache. She'd learned to control her attention the way some people controlled their breathing. She reached inside her jacket. Felt the patch. Ran her thumb across the still rough edges where shrapnel had heated the fabric. The patch measured 3 inches by 2 inches. The emblem showed a falcon in profile, wings spread. Underneath, stitched in silver thread, Valkyrie 6. Kandahar Field Hospital. 2011, the date meant something different to her than it meant to other people. To other people, it meant the year she'd left active duty. To Hannah, it meant the year she'd learned that heroes usually died doing something ordinary that just happened to require extraordinary courage. She touched the patch the way some people touch the cross around their neck. The way some people touched a photograph. It was her only anchor to the person she actually was, to the rank she actually held, to the mission that actually mattered. Everything else, the scrubs, the badge, the generic name, the tired smile, the deflections about her technique, was operational cover so convincing that sometimes she forgot which version was the lie. The contractor in room 314 had received one phone call at 2:14 a.m. International number, routed through 3 proxies. The call had lasted 40 seconds. Hannah had been standing nearby, ostensibly checking the patient's foresight, actually listening to the rhythm of his voice on the phone. His tone hadn't changed. No stress. No urgency. Just business conducted in the middle of the night, which meant whatever intelligence he was selling, it was important enough to move in real time. She needed to report it. She couldn't report it. Reporting it meant using channels that would route back through naval intelligence, and naval intelligence would want her extracted from her position to debrief, and extracting her would blow the surveillance on the 3 other contractors currently operating in Colorado Springs, and blowing the surveillance would mean losing 6 months of operational intelligence that might prevent something catastrophic. So Hannah drank her cold coffee and touched the patch inside her jacket lining and made the decision that all soldiers made eventually, the decision to choose the mission over the person. To choose the numbers that nobody would ever know over the recognition that they might deserve. To choose invisibility. At 4:33 a.m., Dr. Pierce returned to the ER after his administrative break. He walked directly to the central charting station where Hannah was finishing her documentation on the gastroenteritis patient. He stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive, something that probably cost more than she made in a week, and looked down at her notations with an expression of someone examining something slightly unpleasant he'd found in a parking lot. "Your charting is sparse," he said. "Minimalist. Almost like you're trying to hide something." Hannah didn't look up. "I document what I observe." "Exactly my point," Dr. Pierce said. "You observe very little. Or perhaps you're simply not trained well enough to recognize what you're observing. Either way, it's concerning. I'll be observing your work more closely moving forward. Consider this a professional courtesy. You're being watched now." He left before she could respond. Not that she would have responded. Hannah had learned a long time ago that the people who needed to prove their authority were the people most afraid of losing it. She had learned that silence was a weapon more effective than any blade. She had learned that the strongest thing a person could do sometimes was pretend to be weaker than they were. But she felt something shift in her chest as she listened to Dr. Pierce's footsteps fade down the corridor. Something that said the invisible part of her job was about to become significantly more complicated. Something that said the next 72 hours were going to change everything about why she was here and what she was protecting. She touched the patch one more time, beneath the scrubs, beneath the generic exterior, and made a choice that she didn't fully understand yet. She made the choice to survive whatever was coming. The fluorescent lights hummed on above her, indifferent and electric and endless. The fluorescent lights hummed on above her, indifferent and electric and endless. Hannah Clarke moved through the corridors of St. Michael's like a ghost in scrubs, her presence registered by no one and required by everyone. In the ER at 11 p.m., she was simply one more competent pair of hands, steady, efficient, invisible. That was survival. That was the mission. But Dr. Pierce had decided invisibility was an insult. The grand round started at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. 12 residents stood in a semicircle around the conference table while Dr. Pierce, commanding the room like a general surveying conquered territory, pulled Hannah's charting from a patient file. His smile was the smile of a man who had been waiting for permission to strike, and now he had it. The morning light cut through the windows at an angle that made everything look like evidence in a trial. "This," he said, holding up her notes like they were contaminated, "is what happens when someone takes shortcuts." His voice had the smooth confidence of a man whose father had been a surgeon, whose grandfather had been a surgeon, whose entire genealogy was written in credentials and country club memberships. Nurse Clarke here documents like she's writing grocery lists, not patient care. Dangerous. Sloppy. The residents shifted their weight. Nobody looked at Hannah. The youngest one, a woman named Garcia who had once asked Hannah how to start a difficult for, suddenly became very interested in her shoes. Hannah stood at the edge of the group, hands folded in front of her. She took one measured breath. Just one. Her jaw tightened so slightly that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would notice. A single tear escaped, not from fear, not from shame, but from the sheer force of swallowing 17 years of things she could not say. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Dr. Pierce, her hand moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned to process pain as information rather than feeling. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that the residents had to lean in. "I document what I do, Dr. Pierce. You document what you wish you'd done." The silence didn't break. It shattered. Dr. Pierce's face flushed the color of raw meat. His hand trembled slightly as he set down her chart. The residents exchanged glances, brief, electric, dangerous. They had just watched someone without a medical degree disassemble their director with 8 words. He tried to speak, opened his mouth, closed it. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, or maybe that was just the sound of power shifting, tiny and imperceptible but absolutely real. "That's insubordination," he said finally, but his voice had lost its tank engine rumble. It sounded thin now. Defensive. "We'll discuss your future at St. Michael's after rounds." Hannah nodded once and turned away. She felt his eyes on her back like thermal crosshairs, but she had already compartmentalized the moment, filed it away in the same mental safe where she kept her Navy Cross, her combat medals, the faces of the 847 people she had kept breathing through 37 hours of continuous surgery during the FOB Chapman siege in 2011. One insult from a man who had never treated anything worse than a paper cut was not going to be the thing that broke her. What she didn't anticipate was how systematically he would begin building his case against her. The next morning, he was at the vending machine. Hannah needed coffee, real coffee, not the sludge from the break room, and she had made the mistake of thinking 6:15 a.m. was early enough to avoid him. It wasn't. It was exactly the right time to make sure the waiting room was populated. The early birds. The patients waiting for their lab results, their discharge papers, their news. Witnesses. "You know what your problem is," Dr. Pierce said, loud enough that his voice carried across the open waiting area like a broadcast. He was selecting something from the snack section, almonds, probably, organic ones, the kind that cost $12 a bag. "You play hero." That's what happens when someone doesn't have the education to understand their limitations. They try to compensate with drama. Hannah's hand was on the coffee button. Her thumb was on the selector. She could feel the moment crystallizing around her, the exact type of public humiliation that was designed to poison the well, to make her staff question her judgment, to turn her into someone other people pitied and then avoided. She turned. Slowly. Her movement had the quality of something that had been calculated through 1,000 scenarios. Combatives training. Hostage negotiation. Reading rooms and understanding where the pressure points were. Competence doesn't need an audience, doctor, she said. The waiting room heard it. The receptionist heard it. A nurse at the check-in desk heard it. The sound of those words hung in the air like the moment after a weapon is drawn but before it's fired. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't loud. She was just correct, and that correctness was more devastating than any argument could have been. Dr. Pierce stepped closer. His presence did something to the air pressure in the room, made it denser, heavier, the way the atmosphere changes just before a thunderstorm. "That's twice in 2 days you've spoken to me inappropriately," he said, his voice low now, which made it worse somehow. "More controlled. One more time and I will have security escort you out of this hospital. Do you understand me?" Hannah met his eyes. Held them. The trembling, if there was any trembling, was not fear. It was restraint. It was the feeling of having a 9mm Beretta M9 in your hand during a night raid and choosing not to use it. It was the difference between power and permission. "I understand," she said. She selected her coffee. The machine made its sound, that mechanical grunt and hiss of hot liquid filling a paper cup, and she walked back past him without breaking stride. But that was just the beginning of what he had planned. By Thursday, the rumors had taken root. Hannah overheard them in the break room when she thought she was alone, catching fragments of conversation that others were having when they thought she couldn't hear. She was fired from her last job for negligence. She lost her license in Nevada. She was covering something up. The stories had that specific quality of lies that were designed to feel plausible, not the exaggerated kind that people could dismiss, but the kind that operated on ambiguity, on the space between what was known and what could be believed. Dr. Pierce had weaponized doubt. He called in favors from nurses who had once smiled at her, who had once asked her to cover their breaks and accepted her kindness without hesitation. Now they kept distance, their eyes sliding away when she approached. He orchestrated a shift where she was assigned to assist him on 3 separate procedures, each one another opportunity for public correction, another moment where he could shake his head sadly and say, "That's not how we do things here," or "Maybe that worked where you come from, but this is a teaching hospital." Hannah documented everything. Not just the medical work, the vital signs, the medication administrations, the assessments, but the psychological operation being mounted against her. She filed it all away in the part of her brain that had been trained to collect intelligence, to understand enemy tactics, to know exactly what someone was trying to do and why. She was still monitoring room 314. The contractor from Kandahar had been admitted 3 days ago with a bleeding ulcer, and Hannah made sure she was the one who checked his vitals every 4 hours. She listened to his phone calls, watched his visitors, noted the times and durations. She was watching an intelligence target while her career was being systematically dismantled by a man who wanted to control his environment the way a garden wants to control weeds. The irony was not lost on her. That night, sitting alone in the locker room at 11:11 p.m., she removed her jacket and looked at the stitching inside the lining. The faded unit patch was barely visible, just a small embroidered square with a call sign that no one here knew the meaning of. Valkyrie 6. It was the only piece of her real identity she carried, sewn so carefully into the fabric that it would take someone looking for it to find it. She touched it with one finger, the way someone else might touch a wedding ring or a religious medal. She was a captain in the United States Navy. She had received a Navy Cross for valor under fire. She had trained special operations personnel in advanced trauma medicine. She had saved lives in war zones where the only anesthesia was prayer and morphine. And right now, she was being humiliated in front of residents by a man whose most significant achievement was memorizing enough medical literature to sound authoritative at cocktail parties. But she couldn't say any of that. If she did, the mission failed. 6 months of surveillance on the contractor in room 314 would evaporate. Naval intelligence would have to extract her, and the network he was connected to would scatter like roaches when the lights came on. So she would keep being invisible. She would keep absorbing the insults. She would keep her hand steady and her voice calm and her eyes forward. That was the job. That was what survival looked like. Hannah folded her jacket carefully and placed it back in her locker. She didn't know that in exactly 48 hours, she would have to make a choice that no cover identity could survive. She didn't know that a retired Navy officer would watch her perform a field decompression and recognize the exact technique taught only to combat medics in Kandahar in 2011. She didn't know that everything she had sacrificed invisibility for was about to detonate in front of witnesses she couldn't control. She only knew that Dr. Pierce had drawn a line, and that crossing it one more time would give him the excuse he needed to destroy her. What she didn't know was that being destroyed was exactly what it was going to take for the truth to emerge. The motorcycle came through the ER doors at 11:44 a.m., and with it came a retired Navy officer named Lieutenant Commander David Ross, his ribs shattered like dropped china, his left lung already collapsing under its own weight. The trauma team moved with practiced urgency, cut away the leather jacket, expose the chest, run the lines, but Dr. Pierce saw something else entirely, an audience. A teaching moment. A chance to demonstrate his superiority over the nurses who scurried around doing the actual work of keeping Ross alive. Hannah caught the calculation in his eyes before he even spoke. She'd learned to read that look the way a combat medic reads a battlefield: rapid assessment, threat identification, resource allocation. Except Pierce's resources were arrogance and institutional power, and he wielded them like a scalpel. Nurse Clarke, he called across the trauma bay, his voice pitched just loud enough for the residents shadowing him to hear. You'll assist with the chest tube. Try not to make this any worse than it already is. The words landed like shrapnel. Hannah didn't respond. She was already moving, drawing up the local anesthetic, setting out the equipment with the kind of fluid precision that came from muscle memory that Pierce would never understand. Her hands moved through the ritual, 1% lidocaine in a 25-gauge needle, the 36 French chest tube on the tray, the Heimlich valve hanging ready. Ross's breathing was labored, his oxygen saturation holding at 91% but sliding. Not critical yet. Not yet. But close enough that she could feel the clock ticking behind his ribs. The admission papers said Ross had been a corpsman in Kandahar Field Hospital, 2011 through 2013, before a motorcycle accident 2 days ago had decided his future for him. Hannah had seen his name on the roster and felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition she couldn't afford to acknowledge. Kandahar meant a specific kind of training. It meant someone who understood cut-downs and field pressure and how to run a line when the power was out and the only light came from burning diesel fuel in a metal barrel. It meant a potential problem. Or a potential ally. She didn't know which yet. Dr. Pierce prepped the site with the confidence of someone who had read about chest tube insertion in a textbook written by someone who had read about it in another textbook. His hands were steady enough, she supposed, in the way that a surgeon's hands could be steady when they weren't actually under pressure. When the life in front of them wasn't counting on precision measured in millimeters. Hannah watched him position the needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and she saw immediately that his angle was off by maybe 2 degrees. Not catastrophic. Just inefficient. Just the kind of thing that would take an extra 2 seconds, and in a 2-second margin sometimes people died. She said nothing. She stood beside him and held the hemostats and kept her face blank as textured wall paint. That was the art of being invisible, not just not speaking, but not letting your competence bleed through your eyes. Not letting anyone see that you knew better. Ross's breathing was getting worse. 88% now. His neck veins were starting to bulge against the thin skin, venous distension, a sign that the air around his lung was putting pressure on everything else, pushing his heart to the side, strangling his great vessels. He gripped the edge of the stretcher, and Hannah could see the whitening of his knuckles, the fight his body was waging against the physics of his own anatomy. Almost there, Commander, Pierce said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice now, the way predators sometimes are gentle right before they strike. He wasn't talking to Ross. He was performing for the residents. For the institutional record. For the part of himself that needed to believe he was a surgeon and not just a man in scrubs who got paid to make decisions. The needle went in. The rush of air came, the sharp, unmistakable hiss of pressure being released, of the laws of physics reasserting themselves. Ross's oxygen saturation climbed, 89, 91, 93. His breathing eased. The color started coming back to his lips. Pierce withdrew the needle with the expression of someone who had just remembered that he was, in fact, competent at his job, and Hannah felt something like contempt rise in her throat, not for his medical skill, which was adequate, but for his need to be seen performing it. She was focused on securing the catheter when Ross's hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not hard. Urgent. His eyes locked on hers with the intensity of someone who has just recognized a ghost. "That's a Kandahar cut-down setup," he whispered, his voice barely above the sound of the ventilator next to his bed. His breathing was still labored, still fighting, but his eyes were sharp. "Combat clear. Who taught you to run a line like that?" Hannah's hands didn't stop. Her jaw didn't clench. Her pupils didn't dilate. All the biological tells of human recognition, all the nervous system's desperate need to confirm identity, she controlled them the way she controlled everything else, through training that had become more real than her civilian cover. She was a nurse named Hannah Clarke who had worked night shifts at St. Michael's for 2 years. She was good at her job. She was quiet. She didn't have military training. She had never been to Kandahar. She had never worn dog tags or carried trauma shears engraved with a call sign she'd earned in blood and sand. "Just nursing school," she said, her voice exactly as calm as it had always been, as calm as it would have been if Ross had asked her about the weather. An experience. But she felt his grip tighten on her wrist for just a moment longer, and she understood that he understood. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. He'd seen something in the angle of her hands, in the economy of her movements, in the absolute absence of hesitation as the needle went exactly where it needed to go. He'd seen the signature of someone who'd been trained by people who didn't train civilians. People who trained soldiers. Dr. Pierce turned away from the monitor, where Ross's numbers were stabilizing, and Hannah felt the weight of his attention shift toward her like a predator sensing movement in tall grass. "Excellent timing, Nurse Clarke," he said, and there was something new in his voice now, not quite suspicion, but the early warning system of it, the way a seismic detector picks up tremors before the earthquake hits. Though of course, the credit belongs to the attending physician. Hannah released Ross's wrist. She didn't meet his eyes again. She had been trained to compartmentalize, to separate the part of herself that was Captain Hannah Clarke, Navy Cross recipient, combat surgeon at FOB Chapman, from the part that was just a nurse who kept her head down and did her job and never, ever revealed that she was something other than what she appeared to be. The separation had always held before. But now a man who had seen her in that other life, a man who had been there in Kandahar when she was running lines with her hand steady as surgical lasers while IDF rounds walked across the FOB, when she had held lives together with nothing but training and will and the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage because there's no time for dramatics when people are bleeding out, was lying in a hospital bed 6 feet away from her. And he knew. The next words out of his mouth could change everything. 2 days later, shift change swallowed the emergency department in controlled chaos, a nurse's calling report, stretchers rolling, the intercom crackling overhead with the particular urgency that made everyone's shoulders tighten. Hannah moved through the controlled storm of bodies and voices with the precision of someone who had performed triage under mortar fire, her hands already reaching for a fresh pair of gloves when the trauma alert came through. Blunt force chest trauma. Difficulty breathing. En route, 3 minutes out. Lieutenant Commander David Ross arrived on a stretcher like a man coming apart at the seams. His breathing had the quality of someone drowning in air, that terrible shallow gasping that meant his lungs were collapsing against his own chest cavity. His neck veins bulged like steel cables straining against their moorings. His lips had already begun their shift from pink to the particular shade of blue that meant his blood was running out of oxygen, and running out of time. Hannah read his vitals the way others read headlines, BP 89/52, heart rate 146, O2 sat dropping like a stone into a well, 94, 91, 88. The tension pneumothorax was building pressure in his chest, squeezing his heart, collapsing the lung on his right side. Every breath made it worse. Dr. Pierce was waiting in Trauma Bay 3, his posture already rigid with the territorial authority of a man about to perform. He'd called the chest tube insertion before the patient even arrived, before any imaging, before anything except the word pneumothorax had crossed the radio. He stood with his hands already positioned as if holding invisible instruments, and when Ross arrived, Pierce moved toward him with the fluid confidence of someone who had done this procedure exactly enough times to be dangerous and not enough times to be truly skilled. Hannah positioned herself at the bedside with practiced silence, setting up the sterile field, laying out supplies, the chest tube tray with its precise metallic instruments, the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the tegaderm dressing, the suction canister that would catch what came next. Pierce began his approach with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once questioned whether he should be doing something, only whether someone else had the credentials to stop him. His hands moved to the fourth intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and he turned to Hannah without actually looking at her. "Prep the site," he said, and she felt the weight of those two words, not a request, not a collaboration, but a command delivered to someone occupying the space where a subordinate belonged. She was already prepping. The antiseptic swab moved across Ross's chest in the pattern that had saved lives in Kandahar, in the field hospital where the power went out twice a week and the morphine ran short, and you learned that technique was the only insurance policy that mattered. Chlorhexidine, left to right, concentric circles outward. She'd done this 14 times under fire. She knew the anatomy like she knew the feeling of her own heartbeat. But Ross's oxygen saturation was still falling. 85, 82. His lips had shifted from blue toward purple now, that particular shade that meant minutes were separating him from cardiac arrest. His eyes found hers across the chaos of the trauma bay, and she saw recognition there, not fear, but the awareness of a man who had faced this kind of moment before, who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether he walked out of this hospital or got rolled out through the basement. Pierce reached for the needle. His hand was steady enough, but his eyes held the particular quality of someone operating from protocol memory rather than present moment awareness. He was inserting the tube through the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the standard approach, textbook perfect, absolutely the wrong choice for a patient whose anatomy had already begun to rebel. Hannah watched the needle enter Ross's chest, watched Pierce's face concentrate with the satisfaction of a man executing a procedure he'd performed without incident or improvement in 7 years. The tube wasn't working. Ross's O2 was still falling, 79 now, the monitors beeping, accelerating into a rhythm that sounded like panic translated into sound. Pierce seemed not to notice, or worse, seemed to be noticing and freezing in response, his hand suddenly uncertain, his confidence collapsing at exactly the moment it needed to crystallize into action. Hannah moved. Not asked, not requested clearance, not deferred to hierarchy, she moved with the muscle memory of someone whose body had learned to function when her mind was still calculating options. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle from the emergency decompression tray, located the precise point on Ross's chest, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and pushed the needle through with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this when the alternative was watching someone die. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It came out like a pressure valve releasing, like breath held underwater finally given permission to surface, like all the desperate physics of a lung trying to re-inflate finally getting their moment. The needle had found the tension pneumothorax's pocket of pressurized air, and that air was leaving his chest cavity in a way that meant his heart could beat freely again, his lungs could expand, his blood could actually carry oxygen instead of just recycling panic through his veins. Ross's lips shifted from purple back to blue, then back toward pink with the speed of a wound reversing itself. His shoulders stopped their terrible rigid hunching. His breathing moved from the desperate gasping of a man drowning to the measured pattern of someone who had been given back the simple miracle of functioning lungs. O2 sat climbed, 82, 87, 91, 95. The monitor's beeping slowed from panic into something resembling rhythm. The room went dead silent. 12 seconds had passed. 12 seconds of Hannah moving past Dr. Pierce's authority and into the space where her actual expertise lived. 12 seconds during which she had done what he couldn't, what his protocols and his credentials and his careful adherence to textbook procedure had failed to accomplish. Pierce's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion first, that peculiar blankness of a man watching something he didn't expect. Then recognition, as he realized what had just happened and who had made it happen. Then something that looked like shame, which lasted approximately 2 seconds before hardening into something far more dangerous. Anger. The kind of anger that comes from being diminished in front of colleagues, from having your competence questioned by someone without your credentials, from watching a nurse step past you into a moment where you had been too slow, too uncertain, too much in your own way. His jaw tightened. His breathing deepened. He turned away from the bedside without acknowledging Hannah or Ross or the fact that the man on the stretcher was now breathing properly because she had acted and he had frozen. "Get me his records," he said to one of the residents, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who had already begun composing a narrative in which this wasn't a failure but a learning opportunity for the staff. "I want to see his baseline imaging. There might be complications from the decompression." Hannah finished securing the needle with the kind of methodical care that came from understanding that the procedure wasn't over just because the immediate crisis had resolved. She placed the tegaderm dressing, confirmed the placement with the precision that had become as automatic as breathing. She did not look at Dr. Pierce. She did not acknowledge the weight of what had just occurred in front of 3 residents, a respiratory therapist, and an attending physician whose entire professional identity was built on the assumption that he was the most competent person in every room he entered. She simply continued working, because that was what people did after they saved lives. They documented it, they secured it, they moved on to the next thing. The next crisis. The next moment where her hands might be the difference between someone walking out of the hospital or not. What she didn't know was that Dr. Pierce had already begun making phone calls in his mind, already begun assembling the machinery that would transform this moment of his failure into her disaster. He left the trauma bay 20 minutes later, his white coat moving with a particular velocity of righteous indignation. Hannah was still there, still working, checking Ross's vitals one more time to confirm that the decompression had held, that his oxygen saturation was staying stable at 98, that his heart rate had normalized from the 140s back into the 80s. The man was going to live because of what she had done. But not for long, not in terms of her career. Pierce's network activated with the precision of a system that had been designed for exactly this kind of moment. His first call went to Richard Carmichael, the hospital board chair and the man Pierce played golf with every Saturday morning without fail. "We have a serious patient safety issue," Pierce said into his office phone, his voice carrying the particular gravitas of a physician reporting a problem that required immediate intervention. One of the nursing staff performed an emergency procedure without physician authorization, without proper credentials, without any oversight. It was reckless, it endangered the patient, and we need to discuss immediate disciplinary action. His second call went to the nursing agency listed on Hannah's file, the one that had processed her application, verified her credentials, provided her references. Except the agency wasn't really an agency at all, which Pierce didn't know, which meant when the number he called connected to a classified Pentagon line, the person who answered couldn't confirm or deny Hannah's employment without revealing that her nursing position was operational cover, that she'd been placed at St. Michael's by Naval Intelligence, that 6 months of classified surveillance on the contractor in room 314 would be immediately compromised by any explanation. "I'm unable to comment on that, employee," the voice on the phone said, which Pierce interpreted as evasion and which actually meant something far more complicated, something that involved national security, classified operations, and a cover that was currently being pulled apart by a surgeon's vindictive phone calls. His third call went to Harrison Wells, an investigator from the State Medical Board, a man Pierce had helped get appointed 3 years ago and who still remembered the favor. "I need an immediate investigation into a nursing staff member at St. Michael's," Pierce said. "Patient safety violation. Unauthorized procedure. I'll need her employment records reviewed, her judgment calls audited, her entire tenure examined for patterns of dangerous behavior." The machinery began to turn. By the time Hannah finished her shift 8 hours later, the conversation had already happened in the administrator's office. By the time she came back for her next shift, the termination paperwork had already been printed. The hospital administration, swayed by Pierce's credentials and his connections, by the board member he played golf with, by the appearance of impropriety that came from unauthorized emergency procedures, agreed that immediate suspension was necessary pending investigation. Hannah was called to HR at the start of her shift. No warning, no conversation, just a message through a supervisor: "Ms. Clarke, the director needs to see you in human resources immediately." She knew. Some part of her had known the moment Pierce's hand had trembled during the chest tube insertion, the moment her own hands had moved past his authority and into competence, the moment her muscles had remembered that she was a captain, not a nurse, and that captain had performed emergency surgery under fire while Pierce had been in medical school worrying about his board exam scores. The termination paperwork was already on the desk when she arrived. Effective immediately. Pending investigation. Final paycheck would be mailed. All hospital privileges revoked. Please return your badge and ID before leaving the building. Hannah read the paperwork in the kind of silence that came from understanding that explaining her actions would blow her cover, would reveal that her nursing position was operational cover, that she wasn't just a skilled nurse making a judgment call, she was a captain with 37 hours of continuous combat surgery under her belt, operating under classified orders in a hospital in Colorado Springs to watch a contractor who might be selling intelligence from Kandahar to people who would kill for it. She signed the termination papers without speaking. Without explaining. Without defending herself against the accusation of reckless cowboy medicine. The administrator seemed to expect her to argue. To cry. To ask why. When she did none of those things, just signed her name in the particular style of someone signing away 6 months of classified surveillance, he seemed almost disappointed. "You understand that this is for the good of the hospital," he said, which meant he understood nothing. Hannah turned the paperwork back across the desk, stood, and walked out of the office with her hand steady and her jaw tight and the weight of every life that she wouldn't be saving now pressing against her chest like the pressure of a pneumothorax she couldn't relieve. She drove to the diner on Tejan Street, the one that stayed open 24 hours for nurses and truckers and insomniacs who couldn't sleep. She ordered coffee at 3:41 in the morning and sat in the corner booth where she could watch both doors, a habit from Kandahar that had never quite left her bones. The coffee went cold in her hands. The yellow streetlight from outside turned the diner window into a mirror. Hannah stared at her reflection and saw someone she didn't quite recognize, a woman with hollow eyes and shoulders that had learned to carry weight they weren't supposed to carry. A woman who had saved a man's life and lost her mission because of it. 6 months of surveillance. Gone. The contractor in room 314 was still selling intelligence, still meeting with handlers, still moving through the hospital while Hannah sat in a diner drinking cold coffee and understanding that choosing to save one life might have cost her the ability to save dozens. She reached inside her jacket and found the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the only piece of her real identity she carried, a small rectangle of cloth that bore the insignia of a naval medical company she wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The patch was worn at the edges, the colors faded from years of operations, years of being hidden, years of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her reflection in the window looked back at her like a ghost. Captain Hannah Clarke, Navy Cross recipient. Or Nurse Hannah Clarke, terminated for patient safety violations. Or neither. Or someone in between who had forgotten which side of the mirror she actually lived on. The mission was compromised. 1 life saved. Dozens potentially lost. She touched the unit patch one more time and felt the weight of choosing between who she was and who she had to pretend to be. She had no idea what was about to walk through the doors of St. Michael's Hospital in exactly 14 hours. The routine background check triggered something no one anticipated. The hospital security office flagged Hannah's clearance level at 3:38 a.m., not a standard nursing credential, but something deeper, something classified. The flag moved up the chain with the urgency of a biological hazard alert. Within 6 hours, a Pentagon liaison stood in the St. Michael's administration office with 2 Marine colonels and a woman in a charcoal suit whose badge identified her only as federal. They weren't there about Dr. Pierce. They were there about Captain Hannah Clarke, Navy Cross recipient, whose cover had just been compromised by a background investigation meant to destroy her. By noon, the boardroom had transformed into something between a hospital conference space and a military command post. The air tasted like ozone and authority, the kind of pressure that made ears pop. A two-star general sat at the head of the table, uniform immaculate, ribbon stacked like evidence of a lifetime spent making impossible decisions. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander David Ross sat rigid in his wheelchair, the same man Hannah had saved, the same man whose recognition of her fieldcraft in the ICU had started this cascade of exposure. The door opened. Hannah entered, still wearing her hospital badge, her termination paperwork folded in her back pocket. She didn't see the general first. She saw Ross, and something shifted in her posture, the micro-expression of a soldier recognizing another soldier still standing. The Navy liaison began speaking, his voice precise as a laser. "Captain Clarke, we need to clarify some facts." He set down a file. Inside was her DD 214. Her service record. 37 hours of continuous combat surgery during the FOB Chapman siege in 2011, when a supply convoy took fire and the field hospital became a surge center with casualties stacked on floors and roofs. Ross's voice cut through the silence, each word deliberate. Valkyrie 6. Kandahar Field Hospital. 2011. He said it like a prayer, like a secret password, like recognition of someone who'd held his life together with her hands when his blood pressure was 60 systolic and his lung capacity was collapsing. "You prepped my line with a cut-down setup we learned in Somalia. No one else runs that anymore. I watched you do it twice, once on me in Kandahar, once in this hospital." He gripped the wheelchair's armrest. "You didn't hesitate either time." The Marine colonel stood, uniform so crisp it seemed to make sounds when he moved. He opened a citation folder, and his voice took on the cadence of formal military recognition. "Captain Hannah Clarke, Navy Cross recipient for sustained valor under fire. 37 hours of continuous combat surgery during the FOB Chapman siege." Direct quote from the Surgeon General's commendation. Captain Clarke maintained surgical capability despite active rounds impacting the operating structure, refused evacuation, and performed 42 emergency procedures without a break, resulting in the preservation of an estimated 17 lives that would have been lost under standard triage protocols. He paused between each piece of the citation, letting weight accumulate. 2 Purple Hearts. Defense Superior Service Medal. Combat Action Ribbon with Gold Star. With each decoration named, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The air itself seemed to stand at attention. The 2-star general rose. His salute was textbook perfect, the kind of gesture that meant the entire weight of the United States Navy recognized what stood before them. Not a nurse. Not a suspect. A captain. A warrior. The kind of person who'd been trained to hold life in her hands when the world was falling apart. The door burst open. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold, his face already purpling with rage, his mouth moving before his brain engaged. "This is completely outside protocol. You can't just waltz in here and..." He stopped. He saw the 2-star. He saw the formal dress blues. He saw Hannah Clarke standing straighter than he'd ever seen her, and something in his skull told him he'd already lost, but his ego wouldn't accept the translation. This woman violated every standard of care. She performed procedures without authorization, circumvented chain of command, and his voice had dropped to the tone he used when he was certain of victory, when he was about to humiliate someone in front of an audience. But the audience had changed. This wasn't 12 residents. This was the Pentagon. The liaison stood. 6'3", voice like a submarine's hull creaking under pressure. "Dr. Pierce, we're going to need those security recordings from the pneumothorax incident." It wasn't a request. The room contracted. Pierce's jaw clenched. His pupils dilated. He knew, in that moment, standing in a room full of military brass, he understood that the footage showed Hannah Clarke saving a man's life while he stood frozen, and that footage was the only thing that could protect him from what was about to happen. The recordings were deleted during routine system maintenance, he said, and the lie hung in the air like something combustible. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Marcus Webb walked in. Webb was 38, compact, with the kind of presence that suggested he'd been trained to move through hostile territory. Because he had been 12 years as a signals intelligence technician for Naval Criminal Investigative Service, transferred to civilian work after a roadside IED in 2015 severed most of the nerve damage but couldn't quite untangle the hypervigilance. Webb recognized it in Hannah the first time she'd been humiliated in the break room, the way she'd absorbed the insult without flinching, the way her shoulders had tensed just slightly in a posture that Webb's sister had learned at FOB Chapman. "I preserved the backup," Webb said simply, holding up a hard drive. "Every frame. From the moment the patient arrived until he left the trauma bay." He set it on the table with the precision of someone placing evidence at a crime scene. "I also preserved Dr. Pierce's deletion attempt from his administrative terminal at 11:06 p.m. last night. IP address 147.208.34.1. That's Dr. Pierce's office computer. The deletion command was initiated by his credentials. And I have documentation showing he'd been accessing personnel files that were supposed to be sealed. Yours, Captain." Webb's voice never wavered. "I've already uploaded everything to the Hospital Compliance Office and the Colorado Medical Board. They're notified." The room contracted further. Pierce's face had gone from purple to the color of old concrete. He'd already made the calculation: federal charges, loss of credentials, the end of everything he'd built. His hands moved toward the table's edge, a gesture of aggression or desperation, and the two-stars aide subtly stepped forward, her posture suggesting she had several ways to end that movement if it continued. "Your credentials are being suspended pending investigation," the liaison said to Pierce, not with anger but with the flat finality of an automated system. "The hospital board is being briefed on the harassment campaign documented in your communications over the past 6 months. The nursing agency you contacted to verify Captain Clarke's previous employment has filed a complaint with federal authorities. The outside investigator you hired to review her performance has been identified as having a personal vendetta against military personnel. And the peer reviews you submitted for 6 staff members contained factual inaccuracies that will be reviewed as potential fraud." Pierce's attorney hadn't even been called yet, and his career was already gone, scattered like shrapnel across the room. Hannah hadn't moved. Her composure was absolute, the kind of stillness that comes from understanding that you've already survived worse than this. The general looked at her directly, acknowledging her with a nod that carried the weight of formal recognition. "Your intelligence operation was successful, Captain." The contractor in room 314 was arrested by DoD investigators at 0600 this morning. 16 classified documents recovered. Evidence of active communication with hostile intelligence services. Your surveillance prevented a potential breach at Fort Carson. He paused. "You're being reassigned. Report to JSOC for debrief in 72 hours. Your command is expecting you." It took 18 minutes for the boardroom to empty. Pierce was escorted out by compliance officers. The general was briefed by the liaison. Ross extended his hand to Hannah, and she took it, just 2 soldiers acknowledging that they both made it through, that the cover had been blown but the mission had succeeded, and sometimes those 2 things happened simultaneously. Before she left St. Michael's that afternoon, Hannah found Webb in the IT department, sitting in a cubicle filled with the hum of servers and the smell of coffee gone cold. She didn't have a speech prepared. The people who understood what she'd had to do rarely needed one. "I recognize the crouch," Webb said before she could speak. "The way you moved through the hallways like rounds might come through the windows any second. My sister served at Chapman. She mentioned a surgeon who wouldn't stop, who kept operating even when the ceiling had bullet holes in it." He looked at her directly. "She made it home because of you." Hannah extended her hand, and Webb shook it with the grip of one trained operative recognizing another. No words were necessary between those who understood the cost of carrying secrets, of being 2 different people simultaneously, of saving lives while preserving covers that couldn't be blown without risking the mission. The drive from Colorado Springs back to the Naval Amphibious Base in San Diego took 14 hours. Hannah played it as a single stretch, coffee and the hum of highway miles accumulating behind her. Her hands were steady on the wheel, the same hands that had held instruments in a field hospital under fire, that had performed needle decompression in a civilian trauma bay, that had absorbed a lifetime of work people would never know about. 6 months later, the White House. Hannah stood in dress whites, the uniform of formal military ceremony, her medals pinned precisely to her chest. The Defense Superior Service Medal had been added since the Colorado Springs chaos, recognition of the intelligence operation of the classified mission that had finally been declassified enough to be acknowledged. Beside her, Lieutenant Commander Ross stood in full dress uniform, his chest bearing the same Navy Cross ribbon she wore. When the president approached, Hannah's salute was textbook perfect, 14 years of military discipline compressed into a single gesture. The cameras caught the unit patch, finally visible. The faded emblem from her jacket lining was now properly mounted in a shadow box on her office wall at Naval Special Warfare Command, no longer hidden, no longer necessary, finally just a memory of who she'd had to pretend not to be. Ross gave a brief statement to the assembled press. Captain Clarke represents everything noble about service. Competence without ego. Courage without recognition. Strength without cruelty. She saved my life twice, once in a war zone, once in a hospital, and neither time asked to be remembered for it. Hannah's own statement was delivered with the kind of precision that suggested every word had been carefully chosen. I've worn many uniforms and none at all. I've been called captain and called worse. The title never mattered. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Or, she paused, her eyes catching the camera with a glimpse of something that suggested she'd survived things most people couldn't imagine, when the world is finally watching and you have nothing left to lose. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She saluted, turned from the cameras, and walked back toward the work that actually mattered, not the recognition, not the medals, just the hands that healed and the oaths that held. In a community college classroom in Denver, Dr. Pierce stood before an instructor's mannequin and 3 bored high school students, teaching CPR compression techniques to teenagers who'd rather have been anywhere else. He'd watched the White House coverage on his laptop during lunch break, watched Hannah Clarke receive an award he'd spent 6 months trying to destroy her over, watched his entire empire of cruelty collapse because he'd underestimated the quiet ones, the ones who actually knew how to hold lives together. His medical license was suspended pending formal hearing. His reputation was destroyed. His network had evaporated. The board members who trusted him had distanced themselves. The residents he'd influenced had come forward with their own stories of his bullying. And now he taught proper hand placement to teenagers, his hands moving through the mechanical motions of chest compressions, 30 per minute, the rhythm of a human heart that he'd once been trusted to repair. The mannequin's plastic chest compressed beneath his palms, and somewhere in the calculation of his ruin, Dr. Pierce finally understood what he'd been fighting against the entire time, not a nurse who'd overstepped her authority, but a warrior who'd been trained to make impossible decisions in impossible circumstances, and he'd threatened that person to make himself feel larger. The mannequin's plastic face stared at the ceiling with the permanent expression of acceptance that comes from understanding there's nothing to be done. Dr. Pierce removed his hands and showed the students proper technique, finally teaching them to save lives instead of destroy them. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to hide who you really are to survive, if you've ever watched someone in power abuse that authority, subscribe and let me know. Comment below, what would you have done in Hannah's position? And share this with someone who needs to hear that the quietest person in the room might just be holding everything together.